Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Wild, Wild Death, where we talk about all the ways one can meet their maker in the Old West. Each week, we spin the wagon wheel of untimely demise, and whichever mode of death it lands on, we tell you a story about it. My name is Jack James Busa.
I'm Leslie Sadali.
And I'm Susan Busa-Leshner.
Okay, let's get right to it. Leslie, would you please do the honors of spinning the wagon wheel of untimely demise?
Woohoo!
I would love to, Jack. Here we go. Spinning.
I get so nervous when this happens.
Here we go. Oh, this one looks a little different. Today we have death by mysterious circumstances.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got a story for that.
I thought you might.
So here we go. On the evening of October 10th, 1809, a traveler arrived at Grinder's Stand, a roadside inn on the Natchez Trace. By the next morning, he was dead from 2 gunshot wounds. But was it suicide or murder?
Ooh.
The traveler was the governor of the Louisiana Territory, Meriwether Lewis, one of the most famous explorers in American history. If you don't recall, Lewis was a leader of the Corps of Discovery, better known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. President Thomas Jefferson commissioned the expedition shortly after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Their mission was to explore, map, establish an American presence in this new territory, and open trade with the native peoples. It started in 1804 and ended in 1806, and the expedition was a huge success. Lewis was rewarded by President Jefferson with land and with the governorship of the Louisiana Territory. But just 3 years later, at age 35, Lewis was dead on a cabin floor along a trail in present-day Tennessee.
Sidebar. In the 4th grade, I played Meriwether Lewis in my school's musical rendition of that expedition.
I bet you slayed that role, Jack.
I did slay that role.
He shined in the cafetorium in a jacket that we got at Goodwill.
Nice.
And in the video of it, I learned everybody else's lines, and I'm lip syncing everybody else's lines while they say them.
Yeah, he was standing on stage, mouthing along with everybody else, and just barely restraining himself from redirecting it while they were in the performance.
Oh no! And then after, I would correct you if you got. I was like, "Hey, that wasn't your line." Everybody loved me.
All right,
Go on.
back to dead on a cabin floor. Okay. Besides the show that Jack was in, most of what we are taught in school about Meriwether Lewis focuses on his role in the Corps of Discovery. But who was Meriwether Lewis? He was born on August 18, 1774, on Locust Hill Plantation in Albemarle County, colony of Virginia, and eventually moved to Georgia. His youth was spent primarily in outdoor pursuits where he developed his passion about natural history. But at age 13, he began his serious formal education. In his 20s, he joined the Virginia militia, eventually rising to the rank of captain. And in 1801, he was appointed secretary to President Thomas Jefferson. He lived in the presidential mansion and pretty much got to know all of the who's who of the period. Then the Louisiana Purchase happened, and Lewis set off with the Corps of Discovery, securing his place in American history. But when they returned, it wasn't exactly happily ever after for Meriwether Lewis. There was a disagreement about expenses while he was serving as governor that threatened his good reputation. So, on September 4th, 1809, he headed to Washington from his home in St. Louis to clear it up. Evidently, the fastest way to get to Washington at that time was by taking a riverboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans and taking a ship up to Washington.
Wow.
While he was on the riverboat, Lewis had one of his recurring bouts of malaria, which lasted over a week.
Oh.
There was no real treatment for malaria at the time, and symptoms of a malarial attack could include fever, paranoia, and delirium. And while he was ill, the story goes that Lewis was drinking heavily, taking opium,
Lewis.
and had twice tried to commit suicide on the boat.
Wow.
We don't know if that's actually true, but if it's true, that's what they say.
Okay.
What is true is that Lewis had to leave the riverboat at Fort Pickering, Tennessee. He was placed under a kindly house arrest and commanded to go to bed and get well, and all of this was under the watchful eye of the boat captain, Gilbert Russell. They rested up, and once Lewis was ready to travel, he was still pretty frail. Lewis needed support if he was going to travel along the Natchez Trail. And on top of that, the Natchez Trail was known to be dangerous and traveled by robbers and cutthroats. Sidebar, what is the difference between a robber and a cutthroat?
I feel like a robber has an end game and a cutthroat is just a bad MF.
Or, maybe there's no murdering involved in just a robber,
A robber seems less dangerous than a cutthroat.
Yes, for sure.
I have a question. He is governor still while he's
Uh-huh.
so he's going up to like clear some sort of money mishap, which is so weird for a politician to have.
Well, he wasn't really a politician. I think that's what the deal was for him. He was something
They
else,
just
yeah.
kind of made him governor to be like, thank you so much for risking your life. And now we have Ohio or whatever. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, no, you remember the Louisiana Purchase was really big at that time.
Yeah,
It wasn't
it's huge.
just
It's like
Louisiana.
most of
Okay.
America, right? I'm talking
Yeah.
like I know.
Well, western part. Back to the story.
Okay, go on. So they're traveling up.
And there's robbers and cutthroats. And so he's going to have some support. Captain Russell could not get leave to go, so a Chickasaw agent named James Neely was enlisted. Now, Neely was supposed to keep alcohol away from Lewis, but it doesn't look like he did that. Lewis's servant, John Pernier, and Neely's enslaved servant, whose name we don't know, also traveled with them. And before they set off, Lewis borrowed $100 from Captain Russell just in case they had unexpected expenses along the way. And $100 is still, some money, but it was a lot of money then. So everybody gets going and they travel along. On the morning of October 10th, they awoke to find that 2 of their horses were missing and assumed they had just likely wandered off. So the group decided to split up. Pernier and the enslaved servant would carry the trunks and the bags on foot, and Lewis and Neely would ride together ahead. Everybody would catch up at the first roadside inn. That's the plan. And this is where the story starts to get confusing. One version goes that Lewis went alone to search for the horses, with Neely agreeing to catch up with him later. In another version, the servant and the enslaved servant accompanied Lewis. In yet another, they followed sometime later. So, whatever the situation was, on the afternoon of October 10th, Lewis rode up the trail and he stopped at a pair of log cabins that were separated by a breezeway. And this was owned by a man named Robert Grinder. He wasn't home, but his wife Priscilla and his children were. Lewis asked Mrs. Grinder if she rented rooms, and she said yes, and she gave him a place in the cabin across the breezeway from her. And she cooked dinner. Lewis ate with her and her children. And according to her account, Lewis acted strangely throughout dinner, getting up, pacing back and forth, and talking to himself.
Yeah. Mrs. Grinder is very nice. He's drunk, he's on opium, and he has malaria. She's like, yeah, come on in. I'd be like, no, we don't have a vacancy for you. Like, what?
Yeah, well, you don't know what he was like when he came up. If you're eating dinner and someone's, muttering to themselves and getting up and walking back and forth, that would be scary. It just would be.
With your children there? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it would be scary. So eventually, Pernier and Neely's enslaved servant showed up and went to sleep in the barn. Or they were already there. Don't know. Mrs. Grinder tried to make the bed up in the cabin, but Lewis insisted on sleeping on a buffalo hide rug on the floor. Now, this sounds weird, but it probably just meant that Lewis didn't think the sheets were exactly clean. According to one of Mrs. Grinder's accounts of the events, she was kept awake by the sound of Lewis pacing back and forth late at night in the breezeway, talking to himself. Later that night, she said she heard 2, maybe 3 shots and something heavy falling to the floor. And then she said she heard Lewis begging for water, saying, quote, "Oh, madam, give me some water and heal my wounds," end quote.
That's really scary.
It is scary. So Mrs. Grinder was afraid that something or someone dangerous was out there, so she kept her door closed and did not go to help him. She said she peeked through the door and saw Lewis in pain, dragging himself to the water bucket and dragging back to his cabin.
Yikes.
Yeah. When the sun came up nearly 2 hours later, Mrs. Grinder sent the kids to the barn to wake up the servants, who then ran to find Lewis in his room, bleeding on the buffalo hide rug. There was a gunshot wound to his temple and another to his chest. Now, Lewis claimed he wasn't afraid to die, but that he was so strong that it was going to take him a long time to die. But he did, shortly after sunrise. Later that day, Neely finally showed up. He wrote down Mrs. Grinder's first account of what happened, picked up Lewis's personal effects, buried his body.
Whoa.
But the $100 that Lewis borrowed from Captain Russell was missing from Lewis's room. What exactly happened to Meriwether Lewis that night has always remained a mystery, and there are a number of theories. Number 1, the most widely accepted is that Lewis committed suicide. As successful as his life had been so far, Lewis was described as a depressive sort of person. According to Thomas Jefferson, quote, Governor Lewis had from early life been subject to hypochondriac affectations. It was more immediately inherited by him from his father. While he lived with me in Washington, I observed at times sensible depressions of mind, but knowing their constitutional source, I estimated their course by what I had seen in the family, end quote. William Clark, Lewis's co-leader of the Corps of Discovery, also reported that Lewis suffered from bouts of depression, had become deeply in debt, and drank heavily. Clark and Jefferson and most of Lewis's contemporaries immediately accepted suicide as the explanation of Lewis's death. So he's kind of a low kind of guy, and he,
Yeah, it sounds to me like he already sort of had mental health issues.
And also malaria.
And, drinking problems always help everything.
The second theory is foul play. Now, Lewis's mother did not believe the suicide explanation, saying that the kind of wounds Lewis had were inconsistent with suicide. Plus, he was in a high-ranking position, had ambitious plans for the future, and a lack of a clear motive for suicide. Plus, Lewis just wasn't that kind of guy. It is odd that if he wanted to commit suicide, that he would shoot himself in the temple and in the chest in areas that wouldn't immediately cause death, especially since he had been trained in human physiology by none other than Declaration of Independence signer Dr. Benjamin Rush. The presence of multiple gunshot wounds suggests there may have been more than one assailant involved. In addition, there was money missing from Lewis's room after his death. Suspicion fell on Robert Grinder, the owner of the cabin, as he was away during the event and then showed up right after the death. And this might explain why Mrs. Grinder did not offer to help, as she knew her husband was doing the deed. Suspicion also fell on Neely, as he arrived a day after the servant and the enslaved servant, even though he would have been ahead of them on the trail. He also took Lewis's personal effects from his room, and even after the family demanded them back, did not return all of them. In addition, he was working for officials in a political camp that was at odds with Lewis and actively working to get him out of office. Captain Russell, who was the captain of the riverboat, he in particular disliked Neely and placed some of the blame on him, especially for not keeping Lewis away from alcohol. However, nothing came from these suspicions, and neither person was found guilty of anything concerning Lewis's death. In recent years, Lewis's ancestors have expressed interest in exhuming Lewis's body to get more evidence about the cause of death, but so far the Park Service has refused to do so. Okay. Third theory, malaria. Now, I personally think this is the most intriguing explanation. Now, there was a lecture titled A New Perspective on the Death of Meriwether Lewis that was given by the author Thomas Danesi, and I hope I'm saying that right. Lewis shot himself as a result of suffering from such a strong bout of malaria that the intense pain caused him to be temporarily in a deranged state of mind. Danesi references a Dr. John McCullough who wrote in 1828, and I'm really paraphrasing here, that essentially a person in the midst of a bout with malaria is in so much pain that all the person can do is focus on where the pain is coming from. And the pain is so intense that the person loses touch with reality and thinks if they could just get rid of where the pain is coming from, they'd be all right. So in this case, Lewis had pain coming from his temple and in his chest, and he took the only course of action he knew that would immediately get rid of it. Yeah, this is from the lecture. Quote, when Lewis directed the pistol at his forehead, he aimed at such an angle that when it fired, the bullet did not penetrate the skull. Satisfied with the results, he then may have decided to eliminate another pain near the hypochondrium. The pistol ball entered below the breast and once again did not kill him. Lewis performed these actions on himself in the midst of an acute attack of malaria. Every other known treatment that Lewis had tried for his malarial symptoms had also failed. End quote.
So what was the death officially ruled as?
Suicide.
Okay.
So I have one last question.
What's up?
Do you think that the Park Service should exhume the body to find out?
Yes. Think about it. If the two bullets are different, that for sure means that somebody else was in the room and he didn't do it to himself. It again changes everything.
Yeah.
I don't know. I sort of think that's a little disrespectful. I don't know. And
Let
also,
sleeping dogs lie.
Yeah, let sleeping dogs lie, and it happened, and it's fine.
I'm kind of on the let's find out what happened team. Because look, if you can, the guy's reputation is, oh, he was so depressed. Oh, he was drinking so much. That is right. And if you could clear him of he was really ill or somebody did it, that would I think that would be a good thing too.
Even if it was just depression, it's still he's sick, and it's the only reason I think exhuming it for the family would be to know if it was foul play.
But unless his body is exhumed and tests can prove a cause of death conclusively, we will never know exactly what happened 200 years ago on that night at Grinder's Stand, as the only witness heard the event but did not see it. And if anyone there did see something that night, they took what they knew to their own graves.
Let's exhume the body ourselves.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. We gotta go.
If you want to know more about this story, please visit the links in our show notes and follow us on social media at The Wild Wild Death.
Adios, muchachos.
The Wild Wild Death is a 2222 media production.